it became clear that there were elements that were common to multiple species that needed a unified approach, so species that share similar ecological and life history strategies. The ISMP is an umbrella plan. It was approved in 2016, and it outlines relevant laws and policies for imperiled species conservation and groups actions identified in the SAPs, the SAPs, into integrated conservation strategies. So like I said, the plan was approved in 2016. It addresses 39 state-listed species and 21 species that were recently removed from Florida's endangered and threatened species list with that rule change are still included in the ISMP as species of greatest conservation need. So from the ISMP and the subsequent species action plans, SAPs, we developed guidelines. Guidelines detail several key components about the biological background necessary to understand each species or group of species' essential behaviors, and what actions might result in take of those. Also, designed to benefit those species. They provide information on how to avoid take and when a permit is needed if take is not avoided. And they also provide minimization and mitigation options when those permits are needed. So these guidelines are identified in the ISMP as a mechanism to clarify protections that improve the permitting process for state imperiled species. All 60 species that are included in the ISMP will have guidelines developed. We are in the process of developing them. We don't have all 60 guidelines available now, but this is part of the process that we are directed towards implementing. And there are guidelines for both listed and non-listed species. For example, osprey is no longer listed in the state of Florida, but we still have guidelines for addressing when permits may be needed for osprey. Okay, so these guidelines are the last step in the process that started back in 2010 with the species action plans and the imperiled species rule change. They're a piece of what help the community, our customers, our constituents understand if their activities may cause take and how to get a permit when take might occur. So the guidelines I'm focusing on today cover 4 of Florida's state threatened shorebirds. So like I said, oftentimes when there's shared ecological strategies for groups of species, we lump them all into one set of guidelines. That's part of the reason why this particular set of guidelines is 80 pages long, because we have 4 species to cover. These are our 4 state threatened species. We collectively refer to them as imperiled beach nesting birds, or you might hear the acronym IBNB, which we shorten to IBNIB. The guidelines include 2 solitary nesting shorebirds, that would be the American oystercatcher and the snowy plover at the top there, and 2 colonial nesting seabirds. These are the black skimmer and the least tern. So all of these species nest primarily in open coastal habitats such as beaches, barrier islands, spoil islands, and shell rakes. Though they also nest on things like gravel rooftops and occasionally even on sites that are cleared for construction or development. So they really are adapting to any sandy habitat wherever it exists, especially in the absence of available natural habitat on the coast. All 4 species build a nest, I guess, dig a nest by creating a small depression in the sand or the shell or the gravel, whatever substrate they're nesting on. And we refer to this depression in the sand as a strait. I'm not going to go into statistical detail about why each of these 4 species met the listing criteria for state threatened status, but I do want to give you an idea of just how rare these birds are. For least terns and black skimmers, we have thousands of breeding pairs in the state. That sounds like a lot, but when you think of how many white ibis there might be in the state, these are not very high numbers. And for American oystercatchers and snowy plovers, we only have a few hundred breeding pairs in the entire state. And these are the most updated estimates, species estimates based on our Florida shorebird database information. They are clustered in certain areas. You can see on the map, for example, the Panhandle supports about 80% of the snowy plover population in the state of Florida. And as you can also see on the map, the only other place in the state where snowy plovers exist are here in Southwest Florida, mainly in Lee County. So the amount of blue in that map all the way over on the right is the concentration of pairs. So we have very few snowy plovers in peninsular Florida anyway, and most of them, as you can see, are either in Pinellas or Lee. And in fact, Fort Myers Beach is of particular importance for all 4 of these species. It's the only location in the entire state where each one of these listed species nest. Literally right here in your backyard, we have all 4 state listed species nesting, and we also have additionally 1 species of greatest conservation need, that's the Wilson's plover. So when we think of our imperiled beach nesting birds, we think of those big 5, these 4 plus the Wilson's plover, all nesting here on Estero Island. Fort Myers Beach also supports 2 federally listed species in the non-breeding season. That would be the piping plover and red knot. So when I'm talking about how important Estero Island is to shorebirds, I'm not just talking about the importance for breeding. I'm talking about how important it is for stopover during migration as well, so for some federally listed species. Okay, so for trying to nest on Florida's beaches, as you can imagine, there are many challenges for birds trying to nest on Florida's beaches, which have contributed to these declines in these low numbers in each of these species. The primary threats that I've presented to this task force before include human-related disturbance, as well as increases in the number of predators or a predator-prey imbalance, habitat loss, habitat degradation, or exclusion from available habitat due to incompatible management activities. We employ a variety of management strategies and approaches to try to conserve them where it comes to beach nesting bird conservation. We also engage in education and stewarding, predation management in some cases at nesting sites, and clearly need to use regulatory and enforcement approaches, which is precisely what beach nesting bird guidelines intend to clarify, is when those regulatory approaches are necessary. State-threatened beach nesting birds are protected under Rule Chapter 68A, as I mentioned earlier, 68A-27. This is in the Florida Administrative Code, so they are constitutionally protected. The rule states that no person shall take, possess, or sell the birds, their eggs, or their parts without authorization. The definition of take includes these 2 key words, harm and harassment. And these are the words that we tend to focus on when we're talking about what take is or what the impact to shorebirds are. It's important. We often use this when there are, let's say it, what we refer to take when there are activities that may cause harms of take that we most commonly see. So for our state-listed species, take. That's in our general prohibitions of Rule 68A-27 actually further defines take different activities that occur on Florida's coasts, conserve is very conserving these birds are necessary. For example, in the absence of the guidelines that I'm discussing with you today, we have been evaluating and issuing incidental take permits on a case-by-case basis for all of these species. So although the guidelines are new and are here to clarify when a permit is needed, the permit itself is not a new concept, and we have been issuing permits whenever take is unavoidable for these species. The guidelines were developed by Wildlife Diversity Conservation Section staff, which is my work group within the Division of Habitat and Species Conservation. We had input from many collaborators across divisions and sections within FWC, and the process started in 2019. So it has been a multi-year process. And after these multiple years of public engagement, workshops, revisions, and FWC commission briefings, the guidelines were brought to the FWC commissioners for final approval last year in July of 2022. They were approved. This was a two-stop process, so the first presentation to the commissioners was a few months prior to that, and the final approval in July 2022 meant that the commissioners, as our public trust agents for the natural resources in the state, agreed that we were going to move forward with implementing these guidelines. They were approved with an effective date of September of this year, 2023, which is why I'm here today in August, to allow staff to develop a framework for actual implementation. So over the course of the past year, we have been doing as much as we can, engaging with staff on how in 2021. Gov delivery and various emails to stakeholders, news releases. There's a lot of example of this would be scientific research. So if a black skimmer needs to be captured by a researcher so that it can be measured or banded or marked, then this would be take. It would be harassment of that species, but it would be under a scientific collection permit for that take. FWC does not typically issue intentional take permits other than scientific research and collecting permits. Or that we will continue to develop permitting beach breaking because it is. So although we could not fit it in the standard frame, case by case. Avoidance is not possible. So in recognition that take will occur, that take is offset by an identified conservation benefit. Usually this is accomplished through a combination of minimization and mitigation measures. So minimization is an activity that reduces take or reduces the likelihood of take, and mitigation is an action that counterbalances the take. So it would counterbalance take that occurs and provide an extra benefit to the species to offset that take. Prior to the guidelines, FWC typically issued only a handful of take permits for shorebirds annually, and this includes permits identify on the beach. The reason for the increase in permitting isn't necessarily because there's an increase in activity that is causing take, or that there's any change in the definition of take in the guidelines or how take is considered. It's largely due to the increased awareness and the clarity in the guidelines that on species regulations that that are provided to the customer. So throughout the development of the Imperial Beach Nesting Bird Guidelines, FWC staff did create an app that customers can use as an online resource to identify whether their project will cause take. This app we are calling ShoreMapper. Individuals can use the ShoreMapper app to see if their activity intersects with an area that is important to any four of these imperiled beach nesting birds. And stakeholders can use the app to evaluate whether their activities and project timing have the potential to cause take. So it's a GIS app in which the customer, the potential permit applicant would be drawing a polygon around where the work that is intended to occur, and wherever that work may intersect with the presence of historical nesting areas or documented breeding sites, then take is likely to occur. So in this case, like say ShoreMapper identifies that take is unavoidable, then individuals will need to determine the type of take and the extent of take. And that's again what the guidelines aim to clarify. So common types of take include harassment of adults and chicks, harm through significant habitat modification, and harm via direct injury. It's important to note, as I mentioned earlier, that FWC does not typically issue permits for harm. In the case in which permits are issued for direct injury or death of a wild animal or state protected animal, this would typically only be in the case of a health or human safety emergency. The next step in the process is individuals will have to make an estimate of the extent of take. The extent of take is measured that are so basically ShoreMapper has those tools available to assist with evaluating how many pairs could be impacted or how many square feet could be modified. Individuals will determine the minimization and mitigation measures necessary for an incidental take permit. The guidelines are available for a certain number of activities. Mitigation for other activities like beach raking, like I said, are addressed on a case-by-case basis. So it will be to the applicant. It will be left to the applicant to identify those mitigation options that they are willing to present. Regional staff, myself, Alexis, the shorebird biologists, and others will also always talk to the team last year about potentially identifying community resources where these permitted monitors could serve the people for my speech. So when minimization is not possible, then mitigation options are available. Examples of mitigation include on-site establishing a temporary seasonal refuge for the birds, restoring or creating habitat, or in the form of a financial contribution to the Fish and Wildlife Foundation of Florida, which is the nonprofit organization that funds FWC's conservation, is an option when other mitigations are not elected by the applicant.